April 16th, 1866, San Francisco. A bright, bustling Monday morning outside the Wells Fargo and Company Express office on California Street. A freight wagon pulls up, carrying a wooden crate marked only as General Merchandise. It has traveled by steamer from New York, crossed the Isthmus of Panama, and arrived in the Bay Area, leaking a strange, oily substance that stained the wood dark. A curiosity, nothing more. An employee named G.W. Bell notices the stain. He calls over a porter to help him examine the leaking box with a crowbar. They don't know it, but they are standing next to the most concentrated chemical energy source on the planet. At 1:15 p.m., the crowbar slips or pries too hard. The resulting explosion didn't just destroy the building, it erased it. The blast was so violent it shattered windows half a mile away and was felt as an earthquake in the suburbs. Pieces of the building and the men were found 3 blocks away. The crater in the street was deep enough to bury a horse. The official death count was 15, but bodies were so fragmented that accurate identification was impossible. The public was horrified. They blamed gunpowder, they blamed gas, they blamed God. But the investigation revealed the culprit was a new synthetic blasting oil invented by a Swede named Alfred Nobel. The press instantly branded it the liquid devil. They called for it to be banned from the continent. But high in the Sierra Nevada mountains, a group of desperate railroad engineers looked at the crater in San Francisco and didn't see a tragedy. They saw a solution. They realized that the same force that vaporized the Wells Fargo office was the only thing that could punch a hole through the granite wall stopping the transcontinental railroad. This is the story of how a volatile liquid, so unstable that a dropped hammer could set it off, became the foundational tool of the American West. To understand why men would strap vials of suicide liquid to their backs, you have to understand the geology of the Donner Pass in the winter of 1866. The Central Pacific Railroad was tasked with the impossible, laying track over the Sierra Nevada range to connect California to the rest of the nation. But standing in their way was the Summit Tunnel, Tunnel number 6. It had to be bored through 1,659 feet of solid granodiorite, a rock so hard that it laughed at steel drills. The standard technology of the day was black powder. Black powder is an ancient invention, a mixture of sulfur, charcoal, and potassium nitrate. It does not detonate, it deflagrates. That means it burns at a subsonic speed, creating a rapidly expanding gas that pushes rock apart. It is a heaving force, not a shattering one. Against the Sierra granite, black powder was pathetic. Crews of Chinese laborers, the unsung heroes of this engineering war, would spend 12 hours hand-drilling a 30-inch hole. They would pack it with powder, light the fuse, and run. The resulting poof would yield a bucketful of gravel. The progress reports from 1866 are heartbreakingly slow. 7 inches a day. Sometimes 8. At that rate, the tunnel would take 3 years to finish. The railroad investors, known as the Big Four, were hemorrhaging money. The government subsidies depended on mileage, and they were stuck at 0 miles of progress at the summit. They were paying thousands of men to scratch at a mountain that wasn't moving. This is where the chemistry of the 19th century collided with the economics of the frontier. Enter James Howden, a chemist with a background in the shadowy world of European explosives. He knew about Nobel's discovery. Nitroglycerin is not a powder. It is an oily, colorless liquid. Chemically, it is a monster. It carries its own oxygen. When the molecular bonds break, they don't just burn, they snap. The reaction travels through the liquid at supersonic speeds over 25,000 feet per second, compared to black powder's sluggish 600 feet per second. This creates a shock wave, a brisance that doesn't push the rock, it pulverizes it. It turns solid granite into sand in a microsecond. But the logistical problem was terrifying. After the San Francisco explosion, the transportation of nitroglycerin was illegal. No ship captain would carry it. No wagon master would load it. It was considered contraband, more dangerous than carrying the plague. The Central Pacific Railroad couldn't buy it. So they decided to do something insane. They would build a factory on top of the mountain and manufacture it inside the construction zone. In the freezing winter of 1867, amidst snowdrifts that reached 40 feet high, the railroad constructed a crude chemical plant near Donner Lake. This wasn't a sterile lab. It was a wooden shack with lead-lined vats. The ingredients were simple but deadly: glycerin, sulfuric acid, and nitric acid. The process, however, was a thermal tightrope. You have to drop the glycerin into the acid bath, drop by drop, while stirring constantly to keep the temperature from rising. If the mixture gets too hot, above 86 degrees Fahrenheit, it undergoes a thermal runaway and detonates. If you stop stirring, pockets of heat form and it detonates. The men mixing this brew weren't wearing safety goggles or hazmat suits. They were wearing wool coats and breathing fumes that dilated their blood vessels, causing the infamous nitro headache, a pounding, blinding migraine that could incapacitate a man for hours. This was the first symptom of the poison they were brewing, but the headaches were the least of their worries. Once the oil was separated and washed, it had to be bottled. The railroad used whatever vessels they had, often simple tin cans or glass demijohns. Then came the transport. Chinese workers, chosen for their steadiness and sobriety, were tasked with carrying these containers up the icy slopes to the tunnel face. Imagine walking on a sheet of ice, in the dark, carrying a glass jar of liquid that will explode if you slip. The law of the West says these men were considered disposable. The payroll ledgers suggest otherwise. These nitro men were paid a premium. They were the fighter pilots of the excavation war. They were highly skilled technicians handling the most dangerous substance on Earth. When the first test blast of nitroglycerin was conducted in Tunnel Number 6, the results were terrifyingly effective. The foreman drilled a hole similar to the ones used for black powder, poured in the oil, plugged it with clay, and lit the fuse. The explosion didn't sound like the dull thud of powder. It was a sharp, cracking report, like a whip snap amplified by 1,000. When the smoke cleared, the face of the granite hadn't just cracked. It had vanished. The rock was pulverized into manageable debris. The daily progress jumped from 8 inches to 18 inches, then to 24. In the headings where they used it exclusively, they began to tear through the mountain at a rate of several feet per day. But the liquid had a malicious personality. It was unstable. If it leaked into a crack in the rock and didn't explode during the primary blast, it would sit there, lurking. A worker might come along 2 days later, strike the rock with a pickaxe, and hit that hidden pocket. There are no official casualty numbers for these specific incidents because the Central Pacific didn't keep a public record of Chinese deaths. They were simply listed as dropped from payroll. But oral histories in local newspapers from Truckee recount stories of flash accidents where men simply ceased to exist. One specific incident highlights the horror of the learning curve. In 1867, a crew was clearing debris from a blast. They found a frozen chunk of rock that was too large to load into the cart. A worker decided to break it with a sledgehammer. He didn't know that inside the frozen crack of that rock, a small amount of unexploded nitroglycerin had congealed. Nitroglycerin is actually more sensitive when it is frozen. The hammer strike detonated the oil. The worker and 3 others nearby were killed instantly. This led to a new, grim safety protocol. Never strike the rock. Always wash the pile down. Despite the carnage, the economics of the situation drove the usage up. The Central Pacific was in a race against the Union Pacific, which was building from the east across the flat plains of Nebraska. The Union Pacific was laying miles of track a day. The Central Pacific was stuck in the rock. Every foot of tunnel was worth thousands of dollars in future government bonds. The suicide liquid was the only leverage they had. By the summer of 1867, the on-site factory was producing huge quantities of the oil. They were using it not just in the tunnels, but for grading the roadbeds. The technique for using it evolved rapidly. They learned that pouring the liquid into a horizontal hole was easy, but a vertical upward hole into the ceiling of the tunnel was impossible. The liquid would pour out. So they developed a thick paste, mixing the oil with sawdust or black powder to create a primitive sludge that could be packed into overhead holes. This was a precursor to dynamite, which Alfred Nobel was patenting in Europe at the exact same time, but the patent hadn't reached the Sierra. These men were improvising high-explosive chemistry in the dark by candlelight. Let's look at the comparative data. A standard keg of black powder cost roughly $2.50. A pound of nitroglycerin cost roughly $0.75 to manufacture on site. But the pound of nitro did the work of 10 kegs of powder. The cost per cubic yard of rock removal dropped by 50%, even factoring in the specialized labor and the accident costs. This is the hidden variable in the construction of the West. We talk about the grit of the pioneers. We rarely talk about the brisance of their chemicals. The West was built on a foundation of cost-benefit analysis, where human risk was part of the equation. The psychological impact on the workforce was profound. Working with black powder was dangerous but predictable. You had a fuse. You had time to run. With nitroglycerin, death was instant and often unexplained. A jar could explode because of an impurity in the acid. It could explode because it got too hot in the sun. It could explode because of a static spark. The camps were permeated with a sense of fatalism. There is a recorded account of a foreman finding a group of workers playing cards on a crate of nitroglycerin simply because they had become desensitized to the danger. They called it greasing the devil. The climax of this chemical warfare against nature came in August 1867. The headings of the summit tunnel were closing in on each other. The engineers could hear the muffled sounds of the drills from the other side, but the rock was the hardest yet, a core of intrusion granite that broke drill bits every 20 minutes. The decision was made to increase the nitro loads. They drilled deeper holes, used larger charges. The blasts were so powerful they shook the snow off the pine trees a mile away. On August 28, 1867, the wall was breached. The liquid fire had won. The summit tunnel was open. This 1,659-foot passage is the reason trains can cross the Sierra today. It remains one of the greatest engineering feats of the 19th century, and it was achieved almost entirely because of a liquid that was technically illegal to possess. But the story doesn't end with the golden spike. The legacy of nitroglycerin is written in the mining laws and the landscape of the West. The horror of the accidents forced a rapid transition to Nobel's next invention, dynamite. Dynamite is simply nitroglycerin stabilized by absorption into diatomaceous earth, a type of clay. It made the power of the oil handleable. But for that critical window between 1866 and 1868, before dynamite arrived in the West, the raw liquid was the king. Consider the Sutro Tunnel in Nevada, built to drain the Comstock lode mines. Adolph Sutro, the visionary engineer, watched the carnage at the summit tunnel and hired the same chemists. He knew that to drain the scalding water from the silver mines, he needed speed. He used the giant powder, the early name for dynamite, and liquid nitro to blast a 4-mile tunnel under Virginia City. The speed of excavation jumped from 50 feet a month to 300 feet a month. This wasn't just progress, it was the acceleration of the Industrial Revolution. The silver that flowed out of the Comstock lode, liberated by nitroglycerin, built San Francisco. It paid for the opera houses, the mansions on Nob Hill, and the banks that financed the next wave of expansion. There is a persistent myth that the Chinese workers were forced to use nitro against their will. The evidence suggests something more complex. They were the only ones who could use it. They developed a mastery over the substance that the Irish and Cornish miners initially feared. There are payroll records showing Chinese blast bosses earning wages comparable to white foremen. They understood the temperamental nature of the oil. They knew that when the liquid turned cloudy, it was crystallizing and becoming sensitive. They knew to keep it in the shade. They brought a discipline to the chaos of high explosives that saved the project from total failure. However, we must acknowledge the silence in the archives. When a black powder accident happened, there was a body to bury. When a nitroglycerin accident happened, there was often nothing left. This makes the casualty counts notoriously unreliable. Historians estimate that over 200 Chinese workers died building the Central Pacific, many from avalanches, but a significant percentage from explosive mishaps. These men were vaporized, their existence erased by the very efficiency of the tool they wielded. The suicide liquid also changed the medical understanding of the era. Doctors in the mining camps began to notice that men handling nitro had remarkably low blood pressure. The headaches were caused by the massive dilation of blood vessels. Decades later, medical science would refine nitroglycerin into a pill for heart patients, angina pectoris. The same chemical that blew the top off the Sierra Nevada is now used to keep grandfathers alive during heart attacks. It widens the tunnels of the mountain, and it widens the arteries of the heart. It is a strange dual legacy, the destroyer of rock and the preserver of life. Let's return to the image of the 15-foot progression. Before nitro, a tunnel face was a crowded, noisy, dusty hell where progress was measured in inches. After nitro, the work rhythm changed. It became a cycle of drilling, the terrifying silence of the pour, the earth-shattering blast, and then the massive clearing of debris. It industrialized the act of mining. It turned the mountain from an obstacle into a raw material that could be processed. In 1868, a year before the railroad was finished, a reporter from the Alta California newspaper visited the tunnel works. He described the scene of a nitro blast. It was as if the mountain itself had coughed. The ground jumped beneath our feet, and a wind rushed out of the tunnel mouth that blew our hats off. Then came the dust, a cloud of pulverized granite that blotted out the sun. That dust was the smoke of the victory over the Sierra. The economic impact of this acceleration cannot be overstated. If the summit tunnel had taken 3 more years to complete, which it would have with black powder, the Central Pacific would likely have gone bankrupt. The Union Pacific would have built further west, claiming the lucrative government bonds and land grants of Utah and Nevada. The political geography of the American West was determined by the speed of the drill, and the speed of the drill was determined by the blast velocity of the oil. San Francisco might have remained a secondary port, losing out to a northern route. The nitro didn't just move rock. It moved the center of gravity of American commerce. Today, if you hike the Donner Pass, you can walk through the abandoned summit tunnel. It is cold, dark, and dripping with water. Run your hand along the walls. You will feel the jagged scars of the drill holes. But look closely at the texture of the rock. In the black powder sections, the rock is heaved and cracked in large blocks. In the center of the tunnel, where the nitro was used, the walls are different. They are shattered, almost vitrified by the intensity of the heat and pressure. You're touching the fossilized evidence of a chemical revolution. The myth of the West tells us about the golden spike and the champagne toast at Promontory Point. It shows us the photos of the locomotives meeting nose to nose, but it leaves out the smell. It leaves out the acrid sweet scent of almond, the smell of nitroglycerin that hung in the air of the High Sierra for 2 years. It leaves out the trembling hands of the men who had to pour a chaotic liquid into a hole by candlelight. The West wasn't tamed by the gentle plodding of the ox. It was blasted into submission by the unstable, terrifying, and useless toy that killed its users as often as it served them. We remember the gold. We remember the silver, but we should remember the oil, the suicide liquid The substance that proved that in the American West, the only difference between a catastrophe and a miracle was the length of the fuse. The 15 feet per day wasn't just a measurement of distance, it was the velocity of the future arriving, violent and unstoppable.